My husband forbade me from talking to my family. I obeyed for 10 years. But one day, a lawyer called. "Ma'am, your father has passed away and left you $41 million. We have been looking for you for 2 years." What happened next changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think love was supposed to feel like safety. That's what I told myself for 10 years, every morning when I made Daniel's coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, served in the blue ceramic mug his mother had given us as a wedding gift. I told myself that a man who had preferences, who had standards, who knew what he wanted, was a man worth building a life with. I was 26 when we married. I didn't know yet that there is a very thin line between a man who has standards and a man who uses those standards to keep you small. My name is Claire Hartwell. Before that, I was Claire Morrison. And the story I'm about to tell you is the story of how I had to become Claire Morrison again, deliberately, legally, and at great personal cost, in order to survive. Daniel and I met at a conference in Chicago. He was 34, a commercial real estate developer, broad-shouldered and articulate, the kind of man who commanded a room without raising his voice. I was a junior graphic designer working for a branding agency, still figuring out who I was. He pursued me with the intensity of someone who had decided he wanted something and was accustomed to getting it. 3 months later, I moved into his apartment in Naperville. 6 months after that, we were engaged. My mother cried at the engagement dinner. My father shook Daniel's hand and said, "Take care of my girl." I remember that moment so clearly now. Take care of my girl. How wrong we both were about what that would mean. The first warning sign came so gently, I almost didn't register it as a sign at all. It was 6 weeks after our wedding. I was on the phone with my sister Amanda, laughing about something silly, a family joke about our uncle's terrible cooking. And when I hung up, Daniel was standing in the doorway of the kitchen watching me. He wasn't angry. He was very calm. That calmness, I would learn, was more dangerous than any raised voice. "You seem happier when you talk to them than when you talk to me," he said. I laughed it off. "That's not true." "It's fine," he said. "I just notice things." And that was it. That was the whole conversation. But over the following months, those small observations accumulated like sediment. Your mother calls a lot. Your sister doesn't really understand your life now. Your father never approved of me. You know that, right? It creates tension. It affects us. He never forbade anything outright, not at first. He simply made every phone call to my family feel like a small betrayal, a crack in our foundation, a choice I was making against him. By year 2, I was calling Amanda once a month instead of weekly. By year 4, I was calling my parents on their birthdays, and at Christmas, conversations that lasted under 10 minutes because Daniel would be somewhere nearby, not listening exactly, but present. By year 6, I had stopped initiating contact almost entirely. I told myself it was a natural evolution, that adult couples pull away from their families of origin, that Daniel was my family now. I told myself a great many things. We lived in a large house in a quiet suburb west of the city. Daniel's business did well. I had stopped working full-time after our 2nd year of marriage. Daniel felt it was unnecessary, and in the fatigue of a young marriage, I had agreed. I did some freelance design work occasionally, small projects he called "your little hobby without malice," which somehow made it worse. I had friends, though fewer each year, because our social life revolved around Daniel's colleagues and clients, and my old friendships withered from inattention. My best friend from college, Megan, had tried to stay close. She called regularly. But Daniel didn't like Megan, said she was a disruptive influence, said she made me restless, and so her calls too became something I answered only when he wasn't home. Were there good years? Yes. I won't pretend otherwise because the truth is complicated. There were vacations and dinners and moments of genuine warmth. There were nights when I believed, completely, that I was loved. That is what makes this kind of story so difficult to tell and so difficult to escape. It is not all darkness. If it were all darkness, you would leave. It is the light, strategically placed, that keeps you. By the time I was 36, I had not spoken to my father in almost 2 years. We had argued. I barely remembered about what. And Daniel had suggested that perhaps some distance would do us both good. I agreed. I was ashamed to agree. I agreed anyway. It was a Tuesday in March when my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. I was in the middle of reorganizing the linen closet, which sounds mundane, and was, but something made me pick up. Am I speaking with Claire Hartwell? The voice was formal, measured. Previously, Claire Morrison, daughter of Robert Morrison of Charleston, South Carolina? Yes, I said slowly. This is she. My name is Gerald Fisk. I'm a probate attorney. Ma'am, I'm very sorry to inform you that your father passed away 14 months ago. He paused. We have been searching for you for over 2 years. Mr. Morrison's estate, which includes assets, property, and investments, has been held in trust pending your location. The total value is approximately $41 million. You are the sole named beneficiary. I stood there in the hallway of my house, holding a stack of folded pillowcases, and I did not make a sound. I stayed on the phone with Gerald Fisk for 40 minutes, though I could not tell you what most of that conversation contained. I retained fragments. Passed away 14 months ago. Cardiac event. Buried in Charleston. Your sister Amanda was present. Amanda. My sister had buried our father, and I had not been there. I had not been there because I didn't know. I didn't know because I had allowed myself to be cut off so completely from my own family that they could not find me. That last part lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. They had been searching for me for 2 years, not 2 weeks, 2 years. Gerald Fisk explained that my father's estate had tried to locate me through my last known address, which was my parents' home, where I'd lived before moving in with Daniel, and through my maiden name contact information. Daniel and I had moved twice during our marriage. My social media profiles, once modest, had been quietly deleted at Daniel's suggestion years ago. Why do you need strangers knowing your business? My email address had changed when I stopped working. I had become, without fully realizing it, invisible. I hung up the phone and sat down on the hallway floor. I sat there for a long time. My father was gone. Robert Morrison, who had called me Clary Bear until I was old enough to be embarrassed by it, who had coached my little league team even though I was terrible, who had driven 12 hours to help me move into my first apartment and had actually cried, in the parking lot when he said goodbye. He was gone. And I had missed the last years of his life. I had missed his illness, his final months, his funeral. I had missed saying goodbye. Was it grief I felt first, or was it rage? Even now, looking back, I can't cleanly separate them. They arrived together, braided so tightly they felt like one thing. I thought about Daniel standing in the kitchen doorway, calm and watchful, after my phone call with Amanda. You seem happier when you talk to them than when you talk to me. I thought about the 100 small moments since then. The sighs, the silences, the strategically placed observations that had redirected my behavior as surely as a hand on my shoulder, steering me away. He had never forbidden me from calling my family. He had simply made the cost of those calls, in tension, in marital friction, in his quiet, wounded disappointment, high enough that I had chosen, freely and repeatedly, to stop. Had he known about my father's estate? That question surfaced slowly, and once it surfaced, I couldn't push it back down. I got up from the floor. I washed my face in the bathroom sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. 36 years old, 10 years of marriage, a house that wasn't mine, a life that wasn't mine, and $41 million sitting in a trust in Charleston with my name on it. Daniel would be home at 7. I had 4 hours. I was terrified. I want to be honest about that. The version of me who had spent a decade accommodating, adjusting, making herself smaller to fill a shape someone else had decided she should fit. That woman was deeply afraid. Afraid of Daniel's reaction, afraid of conflict, afraid, I realized with a nauseating lurch, of my own husband. But underneath the fear, something else was moving, something that felt, for the first time in years, like myself. I went to my laptop. Daniel and I shared access to our household accounts, and he reviewed the statements monthly. I couldn't call Gerald Fisk from my cell phone without that call appearing on our shared phone plan. I couldn't search probate law from our home network without risking that Daniel might check the browser history. He had done so before, not often, but enough that I was aware it was possible. I thought carefully. Then I got in my car, drove to the public library 2 towns over, a place Daniel had no reason to associate with me, logged into a new email account under a variation of my maiden name, and sent Gerald Fisk a message requesting a confidential consultation at his Charleston office the following week. I told him I would be traveling alone. I told him to please not call my cell number again. Then I sat in the library parking lot and made a list on a scrap of paper. The list had 3 items. 1. Get the full picture. Legal, financial, everything. 2. Open a personal account in my name only. 3. Do not tell Daniel anything until I understand what I'm dealing with. It was a modest plan. It was also the first decision I had made entirely for myself in a very long time. I drove home, made dinner, and when Daniel came in at 7:10 and asked how my day was, I said, "Quiet, nothing special." I had never lied to him so smoothly. I found that I didn't feel guilty about it at all. I told Daniel I was attending a 2-day design workshop in Cincinnati, a continuing education seminar for freelance creatives. It was the kind of thing I had mentioned wanting to do before, vaguely, enough that it was plausible. I booked a real hotel in Cincinnati using our joint credit card, paid for the first night, and then drove to the airport and booked a separate flight to Charleston on a prepaid Visa card I had purchased at a drugstore with cash. Was it elaborate? Yes. Did I feel guilty constructing it? Strangely, no. What I felt was focused. Focused in a way I hadn't been in years. The way you feel when something that matters is finally at stake. Gerald Fisk's office was on the 3rd floor of a historic brick building on Broad Street, 7 blocks from the house where my father had lived. I sat across from a silver-haired man in his 60s who looked at me with the careful, measured sympathy of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had learned how to do it without drama. He showed me everything. My father's will, dated 11 years ago, updated 6 years ago. The original estate valuation. The 2-year search record. Letters sent to my last known address. Calls to phone numbers associated with my name, inquiries to neighbors, even a private investigator hired 18 months ago when conventional methods failed. $41 million in real estate assets, investment accounts, and a family trust established by my grandfather. All of it designated for me, sole beneficiary, with a small provision for Amanda as a contingency. Your sister knew of the search, Gerald said. She provided us with what information she had, but she had lost contact with you as well. Amanda. I would need to call Amanda. There is one other matter, Gerald said, and he opened a second folder. During our search process, our investigator identified an anomaly. He slid a document across the desk. Approximately 2 years ago, a letter was sent to this office. It was purportedly from you, advising us that you wish to waive your claim to the estate and that all assets should be redirected to a charitable foundation. He paused. The letter bore your signature. I stared at the document. The signature was good, almost perfect. A slightly different slant than mine, a subtle elongation of the capital C, but close enough that I could see how it had initially given the office pause. That is not my signature, I said. We determined as much, Gerald said. Forensic handwriting analysis was conducted after your sister contested the letter's authenticity. It was a forgery. He looked at me steadily. Mrs. Hartwell, the letter was postmarked from Naperville, Illinois, your current place of residence. The room was very quiet. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Outside on Broad Street, a car passed. I had been holding the edge of the desk without realizing it. I released it and set my hands flat in my lap. Naperville. Daniel had sent that letter, or had it sent. 2 years ago, which was the same period during which Gerald Fisk's office had been actively searching for me. Daniel had known. He had known about my father's death, about the estate, about the search, and he had forged a letter in my name to divert the inheritance. How long had he known about my father's wealth? Had he known when we married? Had that been part of what I represented to him? Not just a wife, but an access point to a fortune he'd calculated might one day materialize. I didn't cry in Gerald Fisk's office. I noted this about myself with a kind of distant surprise. I sat very straight and asked questions in a level voice. I asked about the legal process for contesting the forged letter. I asked what documentation would be required to formally confirm my identity and claim the estate. I asked about the timeline. I asked about confidentiality. Gerald Fisk answered every question precisely. Before I left, he said, Mrs. Hartwell, I want to say something carefully. If you have concerns about your personal safety or about interference in this legal process, there are protective measures available to you. I would encourage you to consider them. I thanked him. I walked out into the Charleston afternoon, the air thick and warm and smelling faintly of the harbor, and I stood on the sidewalk for a full minute. Then I called my sister. Amanda answered on the second ring. There was a long silence when she realized it was me. Then she said, Claire, in a voice that broke completely, and I pressed my hand over my mouth and breathed until I could speak. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about our father's final 18 months, the diagnosis, the decline, the good days and bad ones. She told me he had asked about me. She told me he had never understood why I had pulled away, had blamed himself, had worried. She told me she had written me letters that went unanswered, had emailed addresses that bounced back, had eventually concluded that I had chosen, deliberately, to leave. I told her I had chosen nothing. I told her what Daniel had done. Another long silence. Claire, Amanda said quietly, what are you going to do? I'm going to get what's mine, I said, and then I'm going to leave him. That was the moment of no return. Not the phone call from Gerald Fisk, not the forged letter, not even the sight of my father's will. It was the moment I said those words aloud to my sister, in a city where my father was buried, and felt the absolute certainty of them. Back in Illinois, I moved carefully and quickly. Gerald Fisk had connected me with a family law attorney in Chicago, a woman named Patricia Okafor, sharp and unhurried, who had handled high-asset divorce cases for 20 years and seemed entirely unsurprised by what I described. In our first meeting, she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and took notes in a precise, small hand. And at the end, she said, "We'll need to document the isolation, the forgery, and any financial control he exercised. That will take some time, but the estate is already yours legally. That process is separate." I opened a personal checking account at a bank across town, using my driver's license and my social security number and a cashier's check for $500 I had withdrawn in cash over 3 separate trips to our joint bank's ATM over 2 weeks. I listed only my maiden name on the account. I received all correspondence by email at the private address I had created at the library. I was methodical. I was quiet. I thought I was invisible. But Daniel noticed. He didn't say anything specific at first. He never did. It was the texture of his attention that changed. He began coming home earlier, asking more granular questions about my days, standing near me when I was on my phone. He checked the mileage on my car once, though he did it casually, pretending to reach for something in the back seat. I saw his eyes flick to the odometer. It was a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after my return from Charleston, when it broke open. I had been on a call with Patricia Okafor standing in our backyard near the far fence, where I believed he couldn't hear me through the glass. I don't know whether he heard something through the window, or whether he had found Gerald Fisk's name in some other way, perhaps on a phone record, perhaps from something I'd failed to hide. But when I came inside, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a very specific kind of stillness. "Who's Gerald Fisk?" he said. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ripples. "He's a probate attorney," I said. I had decided after long thought and with Patricia's guidance that lying at this stage was less useful than controlling what I revealed. "He's handling my father's estate." Daniel's expression shifted. Not surprise. That was the thing I noticed immediately. Not surprise at all. He had already known that name. "Your father left you money," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. And you've been meeting with attorneys." Still that careful stillness. "Without telling me." "Yes," I said, because I found out that a letter was sent to the estate attorney's office 2 years ago, forging my signature and directing the estate to a charitable foundation. I looked at him directly. It was postmarked from Naperville. The silence was very long. "That's a serious accusation," Daniel said. "It's a forensic finding," I said. And then the stillness broke. Not into shouting. Daniel rarely shouted, it wasn't his register, but into something colder and more deliberate. He told me that I was in over my head, that I didn't understand what I was doing, that lawyers would cost money I didn't have access to, that anything filed publicly would become very complicated for me. He told me that people who knew us, who respected him, would find certain revelations about my mental health history. There was no mental health history, but the threat of one being manufactured was implicit. Very interesting. He told me I was making the biggest mistake of your life. He came close to me, not touching, but close. "Think very carefully, Claire," he said, "before you do something that cannot be undone." I stood in my own kitchen and I felt the old fear the deep, trained flinch of a woman who had learned that conflict carried a price. I felt it completely, and then I heard my own voice steadier than I expected. "I've already done it," I said. "It's already in motion, and any further interference with the estate proceedings will be documented and reported." He stared at me for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Calculation, not anger. Then he picked up his keys from the counter and walked out of the house. I called Patricia Okafor immediately and documented the conversation. She advised me to stay in the house, to change no behavior that could be construed as abandonment of the marital home, and to be careful. That night, I stayed in the guest room. The following day, I drove to my friend Megan's lake house 3 hours north. I had finally called her, finally told her everything, through tears and long silences, and I spent 4 days there. I walked the path around the lake in the mornings. I slept long, unbroken sleeps for the first time in years. I sat on Megan's porch in the evenings and watched the light change on the water and allowed myself to feel, in small, careful doses, what the future might look like. It looked like space. It looked like air. It looked like something I hadn't let myself imagine in a very long time. I returned home from Megan's lake house on a Thursday afternoon to find fresh flowers on the kitchen counter. Pale yellow tulips, my favorite, from a decade ago when Daniel still tracked such details. There was a handwritten note leaning against the vase. "I've been thinking. I don't want to lose you. Can we talk?" The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The pen pressed slightly harder than usual. I stood in the kitchen and looked at those tulips for a long moment. Then I put the note in my bag for Patricia Okafor's file and went upstairs to unpack. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel executed what I came to think of, privately, as the charm campaign. It was not frantic or desperate. He was too controlled for that. It was measured, strategic, calibrated to my known weaknesses. He cooked dinner twice, my preferred dishes. He was home by 6 every evening, present in the gentle, warm way he could be when he was trying. He didn't mention the attorneys, the estate, the forged letter. He spoke about our early years together, the Chicago conference, the trip to Portugal we had taken for our 3rd anniversary, the inside jokes that had once felt like evidence of a private language only we shared. Had I loved him? Of course I had. That was not in question. The question was what that love had cost me and whether I was willing to keep paying. One evening, he sat down across from me in the living room, and his voice was different, quieter, lower. The performance of sincerity so precise it almost passed. "I know I've made mistakes," he said. "I know I've been controlling. I want to do the work." He had looked up the right vocabulary, the therapy-adjacent language, the admission shape just carefully enough to seem genuine without actually conceding anything. I watched him speak. I noticed the absence of any acknowledgement of the forged letter. I noticed that his mistakes remained carefully unspecified. I noticed that not once did he say, "I knew about your father's estate and I tried to take it from you." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. He leaned forward. "We could start over. Couples therapy, fresh slate. The money, whatever you're entitled to, I'm not interested in fighting about it. It can be yours." "What I'm entitled to." He said it as though he were making a generous concession rather than acknowledging my legal right to my own father's estate. "Thank you," I said calmly. He waited for more. When more didn't come, his eyes shifted. Barely perceptibly, but I had spent 10 years learning to read the small movements of his face. He had expected the flowers and the dinner and the quiet evenings to have softened something. They hadn't. I was not cold exactly. I was simply no longer permeable. I had Amanda now. We spoke every other day, long calls in my car parked down the street, the way I used to call her before I'd learned to stop. She told me stories about our father I hadn't known, that he had set up the trust specifically after worrying in his last years that I had gotten into something I couldn't see. He had never named Daniel explicitly, but he had told Amanda, a man who cuts a woman off from her family doesn't do it by accident. He had known in the way that fathers sometimes know things they can't prove. He had tried to build a safety net, and I had Megan, who called every morning and asked no profound questions, just, "How are you today, actually?" That word, actually, felt like a gift every time. Someone wanted to know how I actually was. I was building something, quietly, steadily, from the edges inward. I was rebuilding the Claire who had existed before 10 years of careful erosion. She was tentative still, like a limb that had been immobilized and was learning to bear weight, but she was there. Daniel watched me in the evenings with the particular attention of a man recalibrating. He had tried softness. It hadn't worked. I could see him shifting, deciding what to try next. I didn't let him see that I could see it. I remained pleasant, even warm, in the surface way that a decade of marriage had made natural. I answered his questions. I thanked him for dinner. I sat with him in the evenings and appeared, to any outside eye, like a wife deciding whether to repair her marriage. Inside, I was reviewing documents with Patricia Okafor 3 times a week. Gerald Fisk had formally filed the identity confirmation and reinstatement of the estate claim. The forged letter had been referred to the Charleston County District Attorney's office. The wheels were turning, quiet and irreversible, beneath the surface of our ordinary evenings. At night, alone in the guest room, I sometimes felt the fear. Not the old fear, the flinch, the accommodating shrink, but something sharper and more appropriate. The fear of someone doing something real, with real consequences, in real terrain they couldn't entirely control. I let myself feel it. I didn't eat it or reassure myself out of it. I sat with it and then I set it aside and I went to sleep. I was, for the first time in a decade, doing exactly what I meant to be doing. They came on a Sunday afternoon in late April, unannounced, which was itself a strategy. I had learned that Daniel's mother, Patricia Hartwell, operated on the principle that surprise removed your opponent's time to prepare. She was 71, small and immaculately dressed, with a manner that managed to be simultaneously gracious and aggressive, like a velvet glove around a closed fist. She had never fully approved of me. I had sensed this from the first year, but she had tolerated me with the studied courtesy of a woman who understood the importance of maintaining appearances. Daniel pulled into the driveway at 2 o'clock on a Sunday. I watched from the upstairs window as both of them got out of his car. I took one slow breath, then went downstairs and opened the door before they could ring the bell. "Claire, sweetheart." Patricia embraced me in the perfumed, brief way she always had, cheek to cheek without pressure, the performance of warmth. "We've been so worried." They sat in the living room. Daniel had arranged his face into the softer version he'd been deploying for weeks. Patricia set her handbag on her knees and began. It began with concern. How was I doing? Really doing? It must have been such a shock. Her voice carried the delicate implication that my father's death, the estate, my reactions to everything had been symptoms of distress rather than legitimate responses to legitimate grievances. She spoke about how much our family, meaning hers and Daniel's, cared about stability. Then it became personal history. She told me gently and at length how Daniel had always been devoted to me, how he had worried about my isolation, how he had tried to protect me from family dynamics that weren't healthy for you, Claire, and you know that. The framing was extraordinary. My isolation had been protection. My estrangement from my father had been self-care, carefully managed on my behalf. Then it became practical. The estate proceedings, she said, were going to be very public. Forensic documents, court filings, newspaper interest in the forgery allegation, all of it would be very difficult for everyone involved. And contested estates, even legitimate ones, can take years. Years of stress and cost and exposure. She looked at me with an expression of maternal concern that did not reach her eyes. We thought, Daniel and I and our attorney, that there might be a more dignified arrangement. You could receive a settlement privately without all of this becoming a matter of public record. Something generous, something that reflects. How much? I said. She blinked, surprised by the directness. What settlement figure are you proposing? She named a number. It was a large number by any ordinary measure. It was less than a quarter of the estate. The room was quiet. Outside, a lawnmower was running somewhere down the street. A perfectly suburban Sunday afternoon. You want me to accept less than a quarter of my inheritance, I said, privately, and presumably in exchange for dropping any inquiry into the forged letter. That inquiry, Daniel said, speaking for the first time in 10 minutes, is based on a forensic analysis that can be challenged. Handwriting analysis is not infallible. Any attorney will tell you that a trial would be unpredictable. My attorney tells me differently, I said. Patricia tried once more, her voice dropping into something lower and more personal. She said she had always thought of me as a daughter. She said she knew this had been painful for everyone. She said that sometimes people made decisions under stress that they could acknowledge, privately, and move past. The offer she was describing was, she said, an opportunity to move forward with dignity intact. And there it was, that word, dignity. As if the dignified thing were silence. As if the dignified response to a forged letter and a decade of engineered isolation were a private settlement and a handshake and the quiet erasure of what had been done to me. I looked at Patricia Hartwell. I looked at my husband. I folded my hands in my lap. I appreciate you coming, I said. I've heard what you've offered. My answer is no. The estate proceedings will continue through proper legal channels. The inquiry into the forged letter will continue through proper legal channels. If there are further concerns, they can be directed to my attorneys. The room changed. Patricia's face closed like a door shutting. Daniel's stillness broke into something I hadn't often seen from him. Actual anger, uncontrolled for just a moment, his jaw tight, a vein at his temple becoming visible. "You're making a mistake," he said, and this time it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a statement of intent. "Then it's my mistake to make," I said. They left 7 minutes later. Patricia's goodbye was clipped, the pretense of warmth entirely gone. I stood in the doorway and watched the car back out of the driveway. When they were gone, I went inside and sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, the way I had sat on the hallway floor the day Gerald Fisk had first called me. I was shaking slightly. The fear was real and I didn't minimize it. These were people with resources and lawyers, and the motivated ruthlessness of those who feel entitled to what they haven't earned. But underneath the shaking, something else. The same thing I had felt in Gerald Fisk's office, in the library parking lot, in Megan's kitchen when I had said the words aloud for the first time. I'm going to get what's mine. The fear wasn't weakening me. The fear was fuel. It was the precise opposite of what it had been for the past 10 years, when I had felt afraid and made myself smaller. Now I felt afraid and felt larger. I called Amanda. "They came," I said. And I said no. I heard her exhale. "Good," she said quietly. "Good." The deposition was held on a Thursday morning at the end of May in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Chicago law firm. Patricia Okafor had requested it as part of the divorce discovery process. Daniel was required to answer questions under oath about his financial activities, communications, and actions pertaining to both the marital estate and his wife's inheritance. I was not required to be present. I chose to be. The room was clean and corporate, with a long oval table, a court reporter in the corner, and large windows overlooking the city. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Cresswell, who wore expensive cuffs and a watchful expression. Daniel himself was composed, navy suit, good posture, the presentation of a man who was very much in control of the proceedings. I sat to Patricia Okafor's left and did not look at him when he came in. The early portion of the deposition was procedural. Finances, assets, the timeline of our marriage and separation. Daniel answered in measured, careful sentences, qualifying everything that could be qualified. His attorney interjected frequently with objections that were duly noted. Then Patricia Okafor opened a second folder. She had done extraordinary work. In the course of discovery, she had subpoenaed records from Daniel's personal email accounts, a process he had resisted and failed to block, and from the account of a paralegal who had, it emerged, been employed through a shell arrangement connected to one of Daniel's subsidiary LLCs. What those records contained was extensive. "Mr. Hartwell," Patricia said, her voice precisely neutral, "I'm showing you Exhibit 14. Can you identify this email?" Daniel looked at the document. "No," he said. "It was sent from your personal email address on March 3rd, 7 years ago, to a data management service. The subject line is Morrison Correspondence. Continue redirect. Would you like to explain what that refers to?" A beat. The redirect. The emails. Patricia had found not just the forged letter, but the architecture beneath it. Daniel had, over the course of multiple years, arranged for emails sent to my account from Amanda and from my father's personal address to be silently diverted, not deleted, but redirected to a monitoring account he controlled. I had never seen them. My father had written to me. Amanda had written to me. Those letters had arrived and been silently swallowed. There were 43 emails from my father spanning 5 years. Some were brief, just checking in. Some were longer, describing his health, asking about my life, telling me he was proud of me, telling me he wished he understood what had happened between us. The last one, dated 8 months before he died, said, "Clary Bear, I don't know if you're getting these. I hope you are. I just want you to know that none of it was your fault. Whatever it is, none of it was your fault. I love you." Patricia Okafor had printed that email as a separate exhibit. She slid it across the table to the court reporter without comment. Daniel's attorney leaned in. There was a rapid, murmured exchange. Daniel had straightened in his chair, his composure visibly tightening. "The redirect arrangement," Patricia continued, "appears to have been established in the same month you and Mrs. Hartwell married. Is that coincidental?" "I'm instructing my client not to answer," Cresswell said. "You may instruct. The record will note the instruction." Patricia didn't look up from her notes. "Exhibit 17, Mr. Hartwell. This is a wire transfer record from 4 years ago, directing funds from your personal LLC to a Charleston-based research firm. The firm's stated purpose, per its own documentation, was genealogical and probate research." She looked at him. "Were you researching the Morrison family estate?" Daniel said nothing. "Were you aware, at the time of this transfer, that your wife's father had named her as sole beneficiary to an estate valued at approximately $41 million? "My client," Cresswell began. "I would like to hear from your client," Patricia said pleasantly. What happened next was small and to anyone who didn't know Daniel Hartwell might have appeared minor. A muscle in his jaw moved. His right hand, resting on the table, closed briefly into a fist and then opened. His voice, when it came, had a tight, pressurized quality I had heard once or twice before in our marriage. The sound of control exerted over something that did not want to be controlled. "You have no idea," he said, not to Patricia, but to me, "what I protected you from. Your family was Daniel." Cresswell's hand on his arm. She was estranged from them long before. Daniel. Sharper. But the sentence had been spoken. Under oath, on the record, in a conference room with a court reporter transcribing every word. "You have no idea what I protected you from." An admission disguised as a grievance. The acknowledgement of agency, of deliberate action, of knowing involvement, delivered in the cracked voice of a man who had believed, until this moment, that he was managing the situation. He wasn't managing it anymore. I looked at Daniel Hartwell, at the man I had married, had loved, had remade myself around for 10 years, and I felt something shift in me that was quieter than anger and more permanent. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to resolution, the closing of an account. "We'll take a 15-minute break," Patricia said calmly. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city without seeing any of it. It was done. The 15-minute break in that conference room turned out to be the last of the real fighting. Not because Daniel capitulated gracefully, he didn't, but because the evidence had done what evidence does when it is presented clearly and completely. It made the territory untenable. In the weeks that followed the deposition, Cresswell filed 3 motions aimed at suppressing the email redirect records on the basis of how they had been obtained. Patricia had anticipated all 3 and had structured her discovery requests to withstand exactly those challenges. The motions were denied. 2 weeks later, Cresswell filed for a continuance, asking the court for additional time to prepare a response to the evidentiary record. The continuance was granted in part and denied in part. Daniel's room to maneuver was shrinking methodically by degrees. The forgery referral, which had been made to the Charleston County District Attorney's Office months earlier, produced results in late June. A formal charge was filed: forgery of a legal document, a felony under South Carolina law. Daniel's name was on the charge. The charge was also connected to the corporate entity, one of his LLCs, through which the paralegal who had produced the forged letter had been paid. His attorney in the criminal matter was different from Cresswell, a firm that specialized in white-collar defense and charged accordingly. The legal costs were mounting on his side in a way that had real structural consequences for a man whose cash liquidity was less robust than his portfolio had always implied. The divorce settlement was finalized on a Tuesday in late August, 14 months after Gerald Fisk's phone call to my hallway. I sat across the table from Daniel one final time in that same downtown building. Different conference room, same city, same clean corporate quiet. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical appearance. He was still well-dressed, still composed in his surface way, but the quality of his composure had changed. It was no longer the composure of a man managing a situation. It was the composure of a man managing his losses. The terms were not complicated because Patricia Okafor had made them not complicated. Daniel received no claim on the Morrison estate whatsoever. The estate was legally mine, confirmed and transferred, and wholly separate from marital assets, as it had always been. From the marital assets themselves, I received the house in Naperville, which I promptly listed for sale. I had no interest in living in it. A fair division of the joint accounts, and alimony for a period reflecting my decade of diminished professional development. Daniel's attorney had argued for a reduced alimony figure. The email redirect records, introduced as evidence of deliberate professional and social sabotage, made that argument very difficult to sustain. Daniel signed the final documents without looking at me. I watched his pen move across the pages and felt nothing dramatic, no rush of triumph, no flood of grief. I had expected one or the other. What I felt was something quieter and more durable, the specific relief of a weight being removed that you have carried for so long you had stopped noticing it was there. The Morrison estate transfer was completed 3 weeks later. Gerald Fisk called me on a Wednesday morning, the same formal, measured voice that had first reached me in my Naperville hallway, now with a different quality in it. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, using my restored name deliberately, "I'm pleased to confirm that the transfer is complete. Everything your father designated for you is now accessible in full." He paused. He would have been glad, I think. I sat in Amanda's kitchen when I received that call. I had been staying with her in Charleston while the Naperville house sold, sleeping in the guest room that smelled of cedar and old books, walking to the harbor in the mornings, sitting at my father's grave twice a week in the quiet of the afternoon. Amanda was at the table across from me, and she heard Gerald Fisk's words through the phone, though I hadn't put it on speaker. She read them in my face, and her eyes went bright. "Well?" she said when I lowered the phone. "It's done," I said. She reached across the table and took both of my hands and held them. The criminal case against Daniel was still pending. These things move slowly, but the charge was real, and the evidence was substantial, and the outcome, Patricia Okafor told me, was unlikely to be in his favor. I did not need to attend those proceedings. I did not need to watch that play out. I had what was mine. My father had made sure of it, even from a distance, even years after I could no longer hear him. I sat in Amanda's kitchen in Charleston with my sister's hands around mine, and I let myself feel it. I bought a house in Charleston 3 miles from the harbor, on a street lined with old live oaks whose branches stretched across the road and intertwined overhead. It was a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors and a wide porch that faced west, so the evenings were long and golden. I had not bought a house before. Daniel had purchased the Naperville property before I moved in, and I had always lived within a space that was fundamentally his. Choosing this house, each room's color, each piece of furniture, the garden plants along the front walk, it was so quietly profound that I had to stop sometimes, simply to register that it was real. Megan came to visit that first autumn, and we sat on the west porch for 3 evenings in a row, drinking wine and talking the way we had in our 20s, before I had slowly allowed that friendship to attenuate. She told me she had never stopped being my friend. She had just been waiting. I hadn't known how much I'd missed being known by someone who had known me before. I returned to design work properly, not as a little hobby, but as the career I had set aside. I built a small studio in the second bedroom, worked there most mornings with the windows open to the garden. The work came back naturally, the way skills do when they were always yours and were only interrupted, not lost. I established a foundation in my father's name, funding arts education programs in underserved schools across South Carolina. Something he had cared about deeply, Amanda told me, showing me his notes. I was building forward from his intentions. It felt like a conversation with him that was still ongoing. I visited his grave on the anniversary of his death, alone in the early morning. I told him about the house, the studio, about Amanda's daughter Lily, who was 7 and had started calling me Auntie Claire with a matter-of-fact certainty that filled something in me I hadn't known was hollow. Did I date again? Eventually, carefully. There was a man named Thomas, an architect, patient and funny and entirely uninterested in managing anyone, who appeared 18 months after the divorce through a friend of Amanda's. I did not rush anything. I had time. Daniel Hartwell's life in the same period contracted in the steady, unglamorous way that follows from sustained legal and financial pressure. The forgery conviction brought a substantial fine, 3 years of probation, and community service. The civil suit for fraudulent interference, combined with his criminal defense costs and the divorce settlement, extracted a meaningful portion of what he had spent 20 years building. He sold the Naperville house and moved to a smaller property, then to a rental apartment. His business contracted. Associates distance themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who understand reputation as a resource. He did not disappear, but he diminished in all the ways that matter to a man who had organized his identity around the appearance of control. Patricia Hartwell wrote me a letter once, about 8 months after the divorce. 3 paragraphs, no apology, only a delicate implication that I had done damage to a family. I forwarded it to Patricia Okafor for the file and did not think about it again. I thought, instead, about my father's last email. None of it was your fault. I love you. I had it framed on the windowsill of my studio, where I could see it from my desk. It turns out that becoming yourself again is not dramatic. It is 1,000 small mornings, each one slightly more your own than the last, until one day you realize that you live, entirely and without apology, in a life you have chosen. That was the true inheritance my father left me. Not just the money, though the money mattered, but the proof, arriving like a letter finally delivered, that he had seen me clearly, had known I was worth finding, and had built something so that I would have options when I finally looked up. I looked up. 10 years. That's how long I let someone else define the edges of my world. And in the end, what broke it open wasn't courage, not at first. It was a phone call I almost didn't answer. Here's what I know now. Isolation is not protection. Love does not shrink you. And the people who truly see your worth will build something so that it reaches you, even across years of silence.